Good morning, music teachers. I'm Ted Allen. I have recently retired from the Oakland Unified School District, where I taught high school music. I am a white, able-bodied, cisgender male heterosexual and a U.S. citizen. My mother's family emigrated to America in the late 1600s, and my father's family emigrated here in the 1800s. My family has had access to higher education at least as far back as the mid-19th century. The musicians in my family have had access to formal instruction in the Western classical tradition for 4 generations. What I was just talking about was my positionality. My positionality is the sum of my identities. On a spectrum that runs from oppressed to privilege, I identify way over on the privileged end. In my teaching career, I taught classes where the positionality of most of my students was at the opposite end of that scale. The difference between the positionalities of myself and my students was something that I was aware of constantly, and was the source of most of the challenges I experienced in my teaching practice. Positionality is one of many terms from the field of critical pedagogy that I was unaware of during my time teaching. Had I been familiar with the term positionality, as well as with the principles of critical pedagogy, I would have been a more effective teacher, because I would have had the intellectual tools to analyze my position and do a better job of creating classroom culture and curriculum that was more responsive to the needs of my students. What I'd like to do for you in this presentation is to provide a brief introduction into what social justice teaching entails and why we need to do it. I'll show you some of the resources I think would be most useful if you'd like to find out more about social justice music education. Then I'll share with you conversations I recorded with 2 scholars in the field, Christopher Mena and Juliet Hess. They'll be talking about where we are in the process of implementing social justice teaching in America, what some of the academic vocabulary in this field means to them, the difference between multicultural music education and social justice music education, and how they apply social justice education in their own work. The theory underlying social justice teaching originated with Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator who introduced the principles of critical pedagogy. He asserted that all teaching is a political act. Whether a teacher is doing social justice teaching or not doing social justice teaching, either choice is a political choice. As Juliet Hess writes, the assumption that education is neutral and devoid of ideologies is itself political. To engage politically entails questioning, critiquing, and working to understand the ideologies and forces that shapes one's own lived conditions and experiences and those of others. The principles of critical pedagogy are, first, identify ideologies that shape conditions, a process called naming the world. Second, recognize the lived conditions of the self and others. That's the step that includes defining one's positionality. And third, through reflection, dialogue, and dreaming, move to action and transformation. This step is called coming to voice. Note that the last stage of this model involves giving the students the agency to name their oppressions and to take action to transform the systems that cause their oppression. I need to note that critical pedagogy is not a prescriptive method. Paulo Freire made it clear that every teacher should be flexible in adapting the principles of critical pedagogy to the unique needs of their classroom. One of the most visible organizations promoting social justice teaching now is the Decolonizing the Music Room organization, a nonprofit founded by 3 music teachers that has earned a large following. One of the oppressions students experience in music class is white supremacy, as it manifests itself in centering white European music in a position separate from and above other cultures, and granting European music with neutral, apolitical status, while positioning other musics as political. One aspect of decolonizing the music room is replacing Eurocentricity with what Juliet Hess calls multicentricity, in which European music takes its place as one music among many. Social justice music teaching is not an add-on. There is no social justice teaching week. Social justice teaching is a framework through which a teacher examines all their decisions. My colleague Deborah Gold teaches at Melrose Leadership Academy in East Oakland. She writes that social justice teaching impacts everything. Every decision I make in my classroom is either perpetuating the status quo, which is proven to have roots in white supremacy, or is challenging it. For me, I entered teaching through a social justice lens, so I really strive to have social justice at the core of everything I do. The repertoire I choose, the videos I share with my students, the way I speak to my racially minoritized students, the books I read about education, I try to seek it out as much as possible. Because my coursework was centered around El Sistema, the biggest impact is where I have chosen to teach. I see a huge disparity in the availability of quality music education in schools that serve lower income populations, and have made it my mission to build up a music program in a school that is lacking one. Putting an instrument in a kid's hand is such a radical statement in many communities. I wish it wasn't. So this presentation is just a basic introduction to the theory and practice of social justice education. When researching this presentation, I discovered a whole community of scholars who have published dozens of papers and books on this topic. Here are a few places to start if you want to dig further into this topic. I'll post all the sources I'm mentioning in a bibliography at the end of the presentation. First is the article Social Justice and Music Education by Randall Alsop and Eric Shea in the June 2012 edition of the Music Educators Journal. You can find this on the NAFME website. Also on the NAFME website, you can find Juliet Hess's article, Why Equity and Social Justice in Music Education, in the September 2017 Music Educators Journal. I should also mention Juliet Hess's book, Music Education for Social Change, which she'll talk about a lot later in this presentation. A concise 8-page summary of most of the theory behind social justice music education is Elizabeth Palmer's article, Literature Review of Social Justice in Music Education, Acknowledging Oppression and Privilege. That one's in the journal Update, Applications of Research in Music Education, also published by NAFME. Finally, and most accessible, are the wonderful resources provided by the Decolonizing the Music Room organization. They have a website with songs, blogs, resources, and they also run a discussion page on Facebook. Before I introduce Christopher Mena, I'd like to take ownership of a failure on my part in organizing this presentation. Right before I talked to Chris, I was reviewing an article he published in Medium that started with his recount of his frustrations about participating in social justice panels where everyone was white but him. The participants in this presentation are Chris, who identifies as Mexican American, Juliet Hess, who identifies as white, and myself, who also identifies as white. A group of scholars discussing social justice teaching should include Black scholars as well. And I would just like you to know that I'm aware of this. I did reach out to several Black scholars, but due to errors in my organization of this presentation, I was not able to work things out so they would be here. This failure is on me. I own it. I'd like to introduce Christopher Mena, who is a middle school teacher up in Seattle. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. He's published several articles on topics of social justice education, and you can watch his webinar on Afro-Peruvian music on the NAFME website right now. First thing I'd like to talk to you about is in your piece on the optics of inclusivity in music education, You started the article with about 200 words, just going over your identities,
Mhm.
and identity is a very important component of social justice education. And I wonder if you could just review for us why it's important, why it's important for a teacher to reflect on their own identity and the identity of their students.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Well, I mean, the first thing is that, our identity, it's the sum total, of everything that we've experienced in our life, and so all those experiences, they put us on this identity trajectory, as it's called, And so, but with that identity comes a lot of assumptions, that we acquire through our lived experience. So all these assumptions about how the world operates, about, notions of right and wrong, and in the music classroom, what's considered good music or music worth teaching, what's not considered music worth teaching, whose music's allowed, everything, like everything about music, and so we have to reflect on that constantly, just to see like where do our biases lie, like why do we consider this to be good music. I've heard so many music teachers throughout the years say, like, I can't believe they're listening to rap or hip hop, or my kids listen to hip hop and they come in the classroom, they share it, it's like that's not music, and things like that. And so, and really get it and think about why do you feel that way, and that's part of your identity, the music that you were brought up listening to value, or brought up listening to and taught to value. So we have to constantly work on that, because you know um as a teacher, we have to be able to create, curriculum that appeals to all of our students broadly, not just funnel them through one narrow perspective. And so the way that we get there is reflecting on our experience and our biases, and that's going to open us up to like different ways of thinking, and open us up to all kinds of different musics that we can include in our curriculum. So that's, I mean, that's one major reason why it's so important to reflect on your identity, to open your mind to different ways of being, different ways of knowing, and just different ways of doing things,
So I'd like to address um, where where you see the intersection between multicultural education and social justice education. Where do they overlap in your experience?
Okay. So yeah, so the overlap, like I used to, when I was first learning about this stuff, like, I mean, way back when I started, my teacher training, I've always had questions, about, like what music should be included in the classroom, all these things, because I come from this particular musical background that doesn't quite follow that traditional model, and so starting to think about like multiculturalism, I used to think that, multiculturalism is social justice, and it's the same thing. But as I started kind of, really developing my thinking and becoming more nuanced in what these terms mean, I don't really think that there is overlap these days, because of what each idea, multicultural education versus social justice, what they both kind of get at, so I think first we can start off by defining, well, what is social justice education, or what is multicultural education, and what they mean, and what's the essence of those. And so multicultural education, the way that it's been kind of developed and kind of brought about, was this kind of additive approach, where you just kind of, and if we think of James Banks and his multicultural approaches, or his approaches to multicultural education reform, it's this additive approach that's very basic level. It's kind of like the holidays, kind of where we have food and holidays, and while those are important aspects of culture, they don't really get at the deep meaning of like why did these artifacts, these aspects of culture develop, in the way that they did. And so multicultural education is focused on just surface kind of contributions. You know what I mean? And so, um, in the classroom, it doesn't fundamentally change, the inequitable structure of education. That foundation remains. And what multicultural education tends to do is just decorate it, just add, just window dressing basically. And and there's been some robust thinking about multicultural education, but I think a lot of the times it stops short at actually changing the fundamental, I guess, problem with education, that foundation, that inequitable foundation that is built on. And so, yeah, I would say that that's the issue with multicultural education. It's basically, and I don't want to take anything away from multicultural education scholars or anything, but I think the way that it is played out in our classrooms, it just turns out to be window dressing. You know what I mean? Whereas social justice, that's always focused on fundamentally changing that foundation that things are built on, a proactive approach to changing the structure of education to make sure that it's equitable and and more just for all students. So this examines questions of like, so we have a music classroom. Okay, so we see that there's difference in demographics that participate. So why is that? So it examines those questions of why is that, and then it roots out those fundamental issues, and it tries to change them. So social justice focuses more on changing the foundation and all other aspects that kind of concretize this whole structure, to change those. Whereas multicultural education tends to just kind of like leave that and just decorate it with just cultural contributions and everything. But they're both in some context valid,
Mhm.
but I tend to err more on the side of like social justice and and ethnic studies, changing those structures, because for over 100 years now, that music education in the modern high school, like, or in the modern school, like when it was developed, from the 1920s during the progressive era to now, it's yeah, there's been a lot of issues, and there continues to be issues, and there will continue to be issues until we start examining those fundamental problems with our foundation.
So, as a clarifying question, could you say that you could teach a multicultural subject like Afro-Peruvian music, but you could teach it through a social justice lens, but teaching Afro-Peruvian music by itself is not inherently a social justice activity?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Just like teaching jazz. I mean, jazz, there's this huge, like radical black like history in jazz, but that's never taught, because as music teachers we often think that music should be apolitical, and
Mhm.
music emerges from some very heavy political contexts. All this great music that we've heard throughout the years, most of it has emerged from like a political context. You cannot separate music from that political context, and we have to dig into that. As music teachers, we have to dig into that.
Yep. You know what you were talking about. Multicultural subjects are often added as window dressing, and Gloria Ladson Billings noted that way back in 1998 in something she wrote back then, that she said manifestations of multicultural education in the classroom are superficial and trivial celebrations of diversity. That was 22 years ago. Uh, how much, in your experience, looking around the field, you've taught in 2 states and lectured a lot on this. Where are we now in doing a better job with taking multicultural music education deeper into James Banks' levels of authenticity?
That is a great question. Like, where are we now? And well, there's some folks that are doing some amazing work, like decolonizing the music room. They do amazing work. You know, and yeah, and so there's a few groups out there that do this work, that really understand it, that get it. However, in most contexts right now, it's still not, it's still the thinking's still rather early. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And so if we take a look, going back to Banks and his approaches to multicultural education reform, he's got 4 tiers. The first one, if I remember this correctly, it's the contributionist approach, and it's just, again, just the holidays. So you get the Black History Month, you get the Native History Month, and that's it, and that's all you get, and you don't explore it or do any deeper thinking to continue these conversations throughout the year. Okay. And then his final level, like the level that's completely liberatory, is the social action approach, like where you change the fundamental structure of education, of the music education experience, to make it more student centered, and not just this like perfunctory like student centered experience that is like, oh well, you get to pick the song that we played. No, this liberated kind of uh experience, where the kids, they are guiding their own learning, truly guiding their own learning, you know not picking from a curated list, but truly guiding their own learning, and connecting that with social action. So definitely, we're not quite at that point yet, as a community, um, but most people hover around that contributions approach, and I follow quite a bit of these social media groups, various social media groups where a lot of music teachers come and they have these conversations, and just the resistance that I see, of when these teachers, when somebody calls them out like, hey, maybe you shouldn't play that song, just it's still the resistance there. Like, we're not even past
Mhm.
that. We're like, as a
Right.
community, we're not even quite past, admitting that a lot of the repertoire that we use in our programs it's racist,
Hmm.
and because again, we think that music's this apolitical thing and it's all about the art and it's all about, the activity. It's like, no, like we have to examine and come to terms with like the racist history of it. And so we're the community as a whole. I don't think we're even past that yet. So not even like wholly to the contribution. It's like we're not even past the racist part yet.
Right.
You know? But there's some great work being done, by
Hmm.
these groups. Like again, I want to go back to Decolonizing the Music Room. Like, they're doing amazing work. So if you truly want to engage in this work, go to their website. They have a lot of great resources, and connect with the people there, because and just be a part of that conversation. And and if you're truly engaged in this work, it's going to take it's you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to learn a lot. Sometimes you're going to have to just sit back and just observe first, just to see what's
Hmm.
going on. And yeah, but that's my answer. So,
Yeah, just a follow up on what your last comment was. Something I've noticed in the literature, that you don't go to a weekend workshop and get your social justice teacher rubber stamp on your certificate and say, now I'm a social justice teacher. It's an ongoing process of reflection and personal growth.
yeah, I mean, it's this the American form of racism, like the racism that's inherent to the United States, like there's a long history, and you can't undo that in one workshop. That's going to
Right.
take the rest of your life. It's going to take
Hmm.
10 lifetimes to undo, and so the only thing that we can do is commit to doing that ongoing, work, just ongoing work every single day, every single day.
On that subject of doing work, and we brought up decolonizing the music room, which sort of adds to add some more information on your answer about where we're going. I just looked at the numbers on the decolonizing the music room. Facebook now has 8,000 followers, which is represents a quarter of the number of people that are following the massive band directors Facebook group that's been around for what, 10, 15 years. Or
Yep.
the big group is like 29,000 teachers.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everybody. And so tremendous amount of considering that DTMR has only been around a few years, that shows a tremendous amount of interest
Mm-hmm.
among music teachers. Let's get into the subject of decolonization. What is your definition of it, and why do we need it?
Yeah, so this is always a tough one. Like, the definition of decolonization, like, I mean, there's some academic definitions, but I think fundamentally it's it's rooting out, like, just rooting out these white supremacist like hierarchies. You know what I mean? That's I think that's fundamentally what that's how I would describe decolonization. And so some examples, like let's take a well. I think I could best illustrate this with like an example. Okay, this my answer with an example here. So I want to talk about the Philippines. And the American occupation of the Philippines. Okay, so during the American occupation, basically one of the big projects was an educational project, and it was to create public schools and to really, I want to say educate, but it's more like training the Filipinos to be like very nationalistic, And so, and one of the parts of that, one of the components of that was music education, And so music education was taught from this very narrow Western perspective. So rather than embracing, all of the amazing musical diversity that was in the Philippines, the Thomasites and everybody else, and Otto Meisner, the president in 1923, who was one of the big pushers in public music education, you know, he was a part of that colonial project, and they all went there and they brought this very narrow view of music education, and so all of their project was imbued with this white supremacist kind of idea of that, this type of music is better, everything else, you just leave that behind. And even in the books that were used, like Silver Burdette, they were the ones who published the textbooks that were used in the Filipino school project. um even the way that the language was situated in the book, English always came first. Tagalog was always the last verse in these songs. So they had it in there, but it wasn't featured. So rather than and what that implies a lot, rather than teaching these students their culture first, they were trying to supplant it and bury it underneath all of this English. um so that's an example of colonization. Okay, an example of colonization of and how the very specific function that serves. So decolonization would be to kind of do away with that thinking that this type of music is better, it's inherently better, that this whole myth that anything like European derived is always better. And so just to do away with that whole myth, and to allow these people to guide their own learning in their own cultural expressions, and to have it as equally as valid as these other types of music, not putting one type of music in front of the other, but having it all equally valid. So that's kind of a long answer to that, but because decolonization is a messy thing.
Mhm.
But it's undoing those white supremacist hierarchies that situate everything else as lesser. So that's fundamentally what it is. And I hope that example kind of illustrates that point.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's say you're teaching a concert band class, and you have 50 students, and they're in concert band, and they have European instruments and flutes, clarinets, and so on. And most of your library is derived from European models. Um, how would you start about decolonizing it? Do you go out and buy an arrangement of some Philippine music and play it with your concert band? What would be the way that a teacher could start to go about decolonizing their very traditional concert band class?
Mhm. So yeah, I would it's all about resources. Like
Hmm.
like for music teachers especially, it's all about resources, because we're so busy with everything, like running a music program. Like it is an all-encompassing endeavor. And then how much time do we have to actually arrange these tunes, to like learn another musical culture, and then like know it well enough to actually arrange for it. So it all comes back down to resources. But there's approaches that are already out there, that can help you, like break that process down. For example, world music pedagogy. And for band directors specifically, I co-authored volume 4. Like in that book, we break down this process of like taking a piece of music, and how do we unpack it in order to get at um a different musical way of knowing. Like we can still use band instruments. I mean, there's all kinds of bands throughout the world that play their traditional music. One of my favorite types of band music is Zimbabwean police band music, and they use Western instruments, but they're playing like Zimbabwean music on it. It's incredible. You know, Oaxacan banda, specifically Oaxacan banda. I mean, I love banda from the north, but I love Oaxacan banda. They're playing Oaxacan music on band instruments, so it's possible. It's just a matter of learning what's called like the generative form of the music. Like what is the essence of the music, and learning that, and then figuring out ways to arrange it.
Hmm.
And as music teachers, we have those skills, and they're often neglected because we're so focused on, like running music programs.
Hmm.
But there's things out there. I would say definitely check out world music pedagogy. That's a great approach, that will help you to refine your thinking and help you to arrange, for these different musics. Yeah.
So when you've decontextualized the music by taking it from its original form and putting it on your student band, how do you recontextualize it for your students so they're aware of the the original context of the music.
Yeah, well, there's my advisor, Patricia Sheen Campbell, in her book, Teaching Music Globally, she uses this, it's called the cultural prism model. I love this because it's a series of questions that when you're teaching a new style of music, that you answer the questions, and that helps you to like fully like recontextualize the music. It talks about musical beginnings and musical continuities. And so like, where does the music come from? Which context is it played in? Why does this music exist? Why are they using these instruments? What's the significance of these instruments? Who's playing the music now? Like all these different questions. And it's a great approach that, I've used when I do this work for my students. Like for right now, what I'm doing is I'm arranging this piece. It's because I teach orchestra now, and I'm arranging this strings piece from the San Javier Fiddle Band, and this is a group of Tohono O'odham, that are in southern Arizona, and there's some incredible fiddle music out there, and so I'm arranging that because next month we have Native American Heritage Month. And so I'm going to do a little piece and we're going to talk about the context. And I grew up near that place. So I'm going to connect that to like what I experienced. I mean, because there's this huge mission down in, it's the San Javier mission, San Javier del Bac, and it's beautiful. I'm going to bring pictures, like all these things. And so that's how I'm going to recontextualize that. But I hope that answered. I went on a bit of a tangent because
no, it's important. That's the gist of what I'm doing here today is.
Yeah. Because I get excited about that stuff, so I just get going. I'm like, and then there's this, and then this, and then.
Is like practical stuff of how are we actually going to do this? Mm-hmm. Getting back to identity and students' lived experiences, would you want to talk about how that played out in your teaching experience with your Congolese student, Shadrach?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah, that was interesting. That was such a great experience. I mean, that Shadrach is an incredible musician, just amazing, and so my lived experience, like with Shadrach, I couldn't connect. Like, I connected with him, obviously because we developed like this teacher-student relationship through music, and I helped him and his family kind of develop their sound system at their church because he wanted to be a worship leader at his church, And so all the skills he learned in my music classroom, he applied those to his rehearsals. So I would go to rehearsals to help him out, be like, hey, maybe you want to do this, But in terms of his lived experience, like, I mean, my world was so far away from what he experienced as a kid, like from the refugee camp, in Tanzania and all these things. And, so I couldn't relate to him in that context, you know what I mean? Like in that aspect, I couldn't relate to him, but what I was able to do is I was able to figure out like, okay, so where are you right now? What do you want to learn? What are the things that you want to apply music to, And that's where I was able to help him develop those skills, that allowed him like as an immigrant, to kind of maintain aspects of his culture in this particular setting, this church setting. So the skills that I would teach him in the classroom, he would translate that to things that he wanted to use that music for. And so what that necessitated in me is a shift in my teaching, to be like, well, I'm just not going to teach this very narrow kind of, you got to learn the method book and that's how we're going to make music. It's like, no, I have to teach these kids to be more flexible musically so they can apply the tools that they learn in my classroom to their lives and make music that's meaningful to them, and so, and that was an eye-opening experience. I mean, I learned so much from that experience, like working with Shadrach. That was like I'd always been kind of leaning towards that, but that was the moment that I felt like I was allowed permission to really be flexible, and I was kind of scared because, the method book is comfortable, you know what I mean? It's like a little blanket, but, I went with it and I never looked back,
And finally, a question to close out our interview. In your article about newcomer students, the one in which you talked about the Congolese musician Shadrach, you pointed out that music teachers have more curricular flexibility than teachers of math and English language arts because they do not have the highly regulated and tested curriculum.
Mhm.
And I've seen that echoed in also in books by my other guest on this presentation today, Juliet Hess. Would you say that because music teachers have more responsibility, more flexibility in their curriculum, that they actually have more of a responsibility to engage in social justice education than teachers of math and language arts?
Yes, that's definitely, it's a responsibility, because this is one of the few places where, we can really, really unpack, like cultural flows, power dynamics, like all these things. We can really unpack it in our music classrooms, and it's one of the things that everybody in the school engages in. Music, everybody listens to music, you know and I'm always suspicious of people who don't listen to music. I don't know if that's my own bias coming through, but
Mm-hmm.
everybody listens to music, so that's just a natural connection, in expanding our programs, to be inclusive of that, to just to recognize like all musics are valid. What can I do here to make sure that everybody has a place in my program, you know
Mm-hmm.
um but yeah, but but a part of that responsibility as music teachers, we have to examine the history. Like, I'm just going to say that flat out. Like, we have to examine the history of music education in this country, the reason why it was created, the who was excluded at the beginning, why were the musical values that were established in the 20s, why were they even the musical values that persisted all the way through until today? So we have to examine that history, because once we start looking at it and unpacking it, we start to see, oh, that it wasn't equitable, like it definitely wasn't, because a lot of students, particularly Mexican Americans, because that's where my research is, they didn't have access to musical programs. In some spaces they did, but for the most part they didn't, because they were always tracked to these vocational schools. But we have to start examining those histories, and that's what I'm working on right now. That's part of my dissertation. Just examining the history and looking at it. It's completely changed my view of like music education. It's just like, there's some things like that we should probably do away with, and yeah, but we have to be inclusive, and it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility. There's no other way to say it. It's our responsibility. Yeah.
Great. Well, Chris, I really appreciate you joining us today. And it's really important for teachers who are down, deep in the trenches to get their head up out of the trench and look around and find out what's happening, what people are doing in other places on this important stuff. I would now like to introduce my next guest, Juliet Hess. Juliet Hess is an assistant professor at Michigan State University in East Lansing. She's authored, I encountered her by finding numerous articles that she has written in the journals that deal with social justice music education. And she is the author of the book, Music Education for Social Change, Constructing an Activist Music Education, that came out in 2019. Juliet, I thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very grateful for the contributions you've made. They've been really helpful to me in understanding this field. I'd first like to ask you, from your point of view in Michigan as a teacher of teachers and someone who has been active in this field of inquiry for a long time, where are we at in the integration of social justice music education theory into actual practice?
I mean, I think we are now at a point where we have a critical mass of people who are doing social justice work and anti-oppressive work, and that is starting to move into mainstream music education. We've seen over the last couple of years a number of conferences choosing to have their themes be equity focused, and I think, certainly teacher education programs are moving in that direction. And it'll be interesting to see what the executive order does to anti-racist teaching explicitly. And I certainly haven't seen any evidence of it disrupting the pedagogy of where I'm teaching personally. but it's certainly something to worry about.
Which executive order are you referring to?
The executive order that came out about a month ago about it basically against critical race theory and anti-racism and equity education
Right.
uh, for federal agencies. So I think it's something we should certainly be worried about.
Okay. Let's go over some definitions of terms that are someone who is new to this field are going to encounter these terms all the time, and it'd be good to start out with them. How would you define social justice?
So the definition that I use actually comes from Lise Bourgeois. And I think it's really important that she talks about enacting social justice as a verb rather than a noun, like it's something that we do. So her definition is that social justice is the work of undoing structures that produced race and gendered oppressions and systemic poverty, as well as the work of challenging discourses that rationalize these structures. So basically, challenging systems that produce oppressions. And I would extend her definition to include oppressions on the basis of any aspect of identity, not just race, class, and gender, which is are the three identities that she names. So basically, social justice becomes the work of challenging structures that oppress. And I think the key point here is that social justice is an action. So Ibram Kendi's work has gotten a lot of attention lately, and he delineates the difference between a racist and an anti-racist really similarly to that. So he argues that nobody is inherently racist or anti-racist, but what we do is either racist or anti-racist. So he argues that there's no such thing as a non-racist. You're either racist or you're acting racist or you're acting anti-racist. So the goal is to align yourself with anti-racist ideas. And I think that, you know, that really summarizes what we're trying to do in social justice is we're trying to provoke action, that it's not, this is not a passive, this is not a passive way to be in the world. This is an active pushing towards social change.
Right, and I know that that's going to come up a lot as you discuss your own pedagogies.
Mm.
How about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I think for diversity, I struggle with this word because we often use the term diversity to point to a lack of diversity. And when we do that, we're kind of framing diversity as a problem. So when I use the word diversity personally, what I mean is a range of experiences. But the way diversity often gets taken up in the literature and in classroom discourse is like a euphemism for basically being not white. So when it comes to using language, I'm in favor of using as specific language as possible to identify whatever we're talking about. Like we can't solve a problem if we don't adequately describe it. And I think diversity is a really vague word and often gets used when we're trying not to name race. So I would much rather see us name what we're talking about and go from there. Equity is a word that, I mean, it's kind of the giving people what they need instead of giving everybody the same. I think equality is, you know, giving equal shares to everybody, but it doesn't recognize that different people have been systemically oppressed over time, and that has compounded. So I think when we're talking about equity, we want to make sure that people get what they need in a way that accounts for their histories and the ways that systems have impacted them. So equity is a way of kind of leveling the playing field. So that's how I would define that word. Inclusion is another word I don't like very much because inclusion always implies an outside. Music education has typically worked very well for white students. Ken Elpus's work shows us that the majority of students who participate in high school music are white. Inclusion for me implies inviting more people to an already existing table, but I think that's a problem because the table is broken. And that inclusion, we need to rethink what we're doing when we're talking about inclusion.
The next term, which is really core of these pedagogies and these theories, is positionality.
So positionality is where we're positioned in the world. So we all have a lot of different spectrums, like there's gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, religion, national status, like where you are in relation to citizenship in the country. is what I mean by that, and many more. Size is one of them. So we all fit in different places on different spectrums, and the dominant group of each spectrum is the position of privilege. So, for example, with race, that would be white people. Are they benefit from white privilege, and it's a spectrum. So you are situated somewhere on the spectrum between privilege and oppression, and we all fit different places on different spectrums. So it's very rare to be a person who checks every single privilege box, although it happens. And it's also equally rare when you go down all of the spectrums for someone to check the oppression box in every single category. So what Patricia Hill Collins calls it is a matrix of domination. So we actually those things all intersect. So we are all kind of made up of these different intersections of our identities. And there are times where one of our identities might matter more than other times. For example, um, for a gay person who might experience oppression based on being gay, but then maybe in a space where it's predominantly an LGBT community, that marginalization might not be operating in that space if the person is a gay man, and instead a trans woman of color might be experiencing oppression in that space. So it really depends on your situation, and it's kind of a level or an angle of how we're looking at the different identities and when they come to be most important. Does that make sense?
Yes. Moving on into your book, um, Music Education for Social Change, Constructing an Activist Music Education. What was the impetus for that book for you?
So I started the project in 2014, and I started it right after Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson. I was it had been a year of violence, particularly police violence against Black men predominantly, and I was sitting over in my corner of the world, which is music education, trying to figure out how we contribute to making change that actually impacts some of what is going on in the world. So I remember being really impressed by, I don't know if this was something you saw, but there was a video that circulated on YouTube at the time that was a group of protesters who interrupted the St. Louis Symphony in protest of Michael Brown.
Hmm.
And it
I
was
did see
really
that.
powerful.
Yeah.
They sang "Which Side Are You On?" The Florence Reese song.
Hmm.
And it made me think, like, music can be a powerful interruption to injustice. And that was clearly evident in that video. And I think, there's so many historical examples of music being activist and being parts of different movements that have motivated social change over time. It certainly was fundamental in the civil rights movement. So it really got me thinking, like, what can we do over in our corner of the world that might make a difference? And what I decided to do was talk with 20 people who identified as both activist and musician. I wasn't looking for teachers necessarily, because I was looking for people who actually do the activist musician work in the world. And one of the questions that I asked them is, like, given who you are and what you do, like who you are in the world, what would you have liked to have had? Like, what would have set you up in the classroom to do you? And that was really the fundamental kind of beginning of the project. And I was working on it in fall 2014, and then, as you know, in November, Tamir Rice was killed. And I think, for a 12-year-old to be murdered by the police just brought it so much closer to home in terms of, like, thinking about being in the classroom and thinking about working with students who, you know, might be worried about wearing their hoodie when they leave the classroom because they're they're cold, but they're not going to risk it. And all of the things that go through their minds as someone who is their age uh, was killed. And I, I mean, teaching in the classroom at that time, like, I mean, it. We need to do something pedagogically to support students who are dealing with that kind of news. And I think it's only gotten worse. I mean, it's so interesting to me that this book really emerged at a Black Lives Matter, because we never left that moment. And it's perhaps intensified, well, certainly intensified in the last 4 years under Trump, and with the murder of George Floyd in the summer, and Regis Kirkinski Paquette in Canada.
Mhm.
And I mean, there were just Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, like there are so many people who have been killed in the last several months, and the list just keeps mounting. So the work seems to be even more necessary, and we need to be thinking about the way that violence affects youth and what their responses are to the news. And I think this is a way to do that, or I hope it is.
Mhm. So you saw this as a response to an urgent, crucial need,
Mm-hmm. What
and so could we say responsibility, a response and a responsibility?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reviewers of my book, because I had 4 reviewers review it before it was published, said that anger isn't a reason to motivate pedagogy, but I actually think that it is,
Hmm.
and that I think some of our deepest motivations come from being really upset about something,
Hmm.
and that those are moments to seize on, not to shy away from.
Hmm. It's interesting. I reading your book, the emotion of anger never once crossed my mind. I was much more. I think the emotion of love was much more predominant. I never. Um,
Well, and I
I,
think we productive, like just
yes.
as you start from anger
Hmm.
doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's unproductive,
Yeah.
and we can produce a lot from being upset about something.
I got the. I don't think I felt the motivation was out of love, out of anger, but out of necessity. I felt it was more of a this is what we have to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and these are the steps
I hope so.
we'll take. What steps would teachers take to address the need that you identified?
So
Um,
what I put forward in the book was a trifaceted pedagogy for music education. So it's multifaceted. The first question that I talked to activist musicians about is how they viewed the role of music in the world, because they were all activist musicians. They were making music actively. And one of the things that they said was music as a means of connection. Another thing was that music as a means of expression. They also said that music was political. And I think this is a really important piece, is that music can be dangerous. And I think that as music educators, we sometimes forget that piece, that there can be negative outcomes when we do music education. And I think remembering that is important. So what happened is I took um, the way they thought about music and expanded that into pedagogy. So music as a means for connection became a pedagogy of community, as music education as connection, and music education or music as expression became music education as expression, as a means to expression, a pedagogy of expression. And then the third piece, music education as political, became a pedagogy of noticing. So what I'm looking for in each of those things, I think the pedagogy of community was three fundamental things. So this idea of connection, that first piece is building community locally. So like building community within your classroom, which is something that I think, I mean, music teachers do that so well. Like we're so used to like building community among our students in our ensembles, whatever group we happen to have in front of us, like that music is a culture.
mhm.
And I think that's something we do really well in our field, is connect people together. The second aspect of building or pedagogy of community is connecting to histories. So really thinking about the cultural context of music, thinking about music as a human practice, and recognizing that, you know, what music is always whose music. That's something that Deborah Bradley talks about. And I think when we recognize that whatever music we're doing in the classroom belongs to somebody, and we take that responsibility seriously, I think that deepens our practice. And then the third piece of the pedagogy of community, and I'm still not totally happy with what I called it, because I really didn't know what to call it. And I called it connecting to unfamiliar others. And what I mean by that is connecting to people who aren't in your immediate kind of circle or community, uh, pushing a little bit beyond that. And when you do a music, for example, from Ghana, you're making a connection with people who practice the music who are in Ghana. And that connection places you in an encounter with a group you don't ordinarily encounter perhaps in your everyday life. And I think that those encounters teach us something. And particularly in this polarized climate, that's a really valuable thing for us to be doing, is encountering people who might be outside of our circle and recognizing that what they bring to the encounter is very valuable. I think we would do well to remember that right now in this political climate. And then the second piece is the pedagogy of expression. So really what I had there, like 18 of the 20 musicians who I interviewed basically said, like, songwriting needs to be curriculum. Like, they thought that the fact that that wasn't a regular practice in music education didn't make any sense, because of course they're active songwriters and regularly creating music. So one of the things that they talked about, I think when we talk about sharing lived experiences, the first piece we have to do is honor lived experiences. So we need to make sure students feel validated in the classroom before we can invite them to share their music necessarily. So I think that pedagogy of expression is that two piece. It's the honoring and the sharing. And there are so many ways that we can invite people to share their experiences musically. It's so multifaceted and open, and it doesn't have to be super complex. And then that third piece, the pedagogy of noticing, is a way to notice ideologies, to recognize the lived conditions that youth might be facing in their own environments. So helping them recognize what shapes their lives and what ideologies affect them. Difficult, like, I certainly didn't learn until I was an adult, to recognize the ideologies circulating around us. And I think that that's the skill that we can teach to kids, and how powerful it would be if students could recognize what is influencing, what is shaping their lives. And then the important piece of the pedagogy of noticing is the moving to action, so doing something about it. And that's tricky in a school context because there might not always be the possibility for that. So I think, where I left the book is that, perhaps we don't really meet the definition of activism in this book, because we can't necessarily move to action in a way that activism in the streets would look like, which is part of the definition of activism. But I think we certainly, like with those three pedagogies, we're creating the conditions for students to take up an activist position at some time later after they critically analyze the world. So those are kind of the three elements of how I propose going about this work.
Yeah, I noticed that chapter on activism, you did sort of say it might not be possible in all situations, and you mentioned one writer who said that if your goal is social action, maybe music teaching isn't the right career for you.
Right.
And that's going to vary from community to community. I have a student who, recent alumnus from my high school, who at the end of last year, in the, I think it was the first weekend in June, he and just a couple friends of his basically single-handedly organized a demonstration of 15,000 people in
Wow.
central Oakland. So depending on your community, students can take their activism from the class or not.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, we can't always directly get there in the classroom, but I think we certainly can set the conditions.
Right.
And for critical thinking, for connecting with others, like those things built for just being human. And I think these are things that we also need to relearn in this country at this point, just given the polarization and what we're experiencing, and the threat of violence after the election, I think is very real.
Right.
And we need to learn how to be human together.
I might be oversimplifying, but there's an implication from the artists that you interviewed were taking an overtly activist stance. They were seeking out to produce social change through their music. And I've seen other teachers who have published articles on social justice education who have just provided a list of these are social justice songs and that you can use. And that I'm concerned that that type of social justice education, where you just bring in some songs that are quote unquote social justice songs, tends to be just an additive type of exposure to social justice songs where social justice is just added in. You're doing the checkbox, and it's not an entire conception of social justice education leading to social justice change organically through the curriculum and the pedagogy. That said, social justice music, songs that are overtly social justice, where the lyrics are engaging with a particular oppression and encouraging the listener to a particular action, such as a song like that would be the song Fight the Power by Public Enemy, or Fables of Faubus by Charles Mingus. That's in the grand scope of the world of music, that's a small repertoire. And as music educators, we wouldn't want to, on the one hand, tokenize and stereotype social justice repertoire. On the other hand, we would want to, since all teaching is political, we want to be engaged with social justice education when we're teaching songs like a Caribbean game song or an Appalachian love song or a mariachi ballad. How do we teach social justice through music that is not overtly activist?
I mean, I think it goes back to that idea, like the what music is whose music. Like whatever music that you're doing always belongs to somebody. So it's that idea, the pedagogy of community, the connecting to histories piece. Like we need to situate musics and human practices. Every music emerges from a context. And I think when we honor that context and we look at it and actually see like where this piece of music emerged from, there's always something to learn about the people who have produced the piece of music. And I think actually doing the work to recognize the value of what everybody brings through their music does some powerful teaching, because we come to recognize the value of human beings and recognize the humanity in people who we might not necessarily see the humanity in, which is a real problem right now, is that we're not recognizing humanity in others. And I think that, you know, when something isn't explicitly political, we still have a lot to learn about the humans who have produced it. And that, you know, engaging in that way, I think is pretty powerful. And I think in terms of like being worried about an additive approach, I mean, I think an integrative approach is really important. And I've written about that just in terms of like making sure that we're making connections between musics and being explicit about them. I don't think, you know, I don't think we necessarily need to move away from classical music, but I do think we need to talk about how it's come to be materially privileged. Like it has taken a huge place in our curriculum. And one of the ways that we can address that is by talking about it and being clear with students, like how this has come to be privileged. And, you know, privileging a Western European art form, that's a really interesting move. And we can have conversations about that too. Like it's still a human practice, and spotlighting how it's come to be privileged is a way to kind of put it in conversation with other musics. And we can think about, you know, what doesn't get to take the whole of a curriculum versus what does.
Great, wonderful answer. Often in discussions on this topic, multicultural music education and social justice music education get conflated as if they're almost the same thing. And there's some points of connection between them and some points where they diverge. Could you talk about the relationship of multicultural music education as opposed to social justice music education?
Yeah, I mean, so I really worry with multiculturalism that we're kind of doing a let's go to Ghana type activity with
Mhm.
students, and we're you know going different places figuratively in the world and grabbing a piece that might be fun but doesn't necessarily engage like the humans behind it, and it's not necessarily a movement that does the difficult work of what it means to engage with the music that isn't yours. And I think that's often where we get into issues like cultural appropriation. And I think there's a lot about the multicultural movement that is appropriative. And I think, um, there have been movements like critical multiculturalism, which is, aligned in a lot of ways with anti-racism, that has more critical principles and allows us to think more deeply about power relations. I think, if I was going to distinguish between multiculturalism and an anti-oppressive education, I think what multiculturalism doesn't do is talk about power and address what the power is and saying, hey, let's go to Ghana and do this
Mhm.
song, and how much privilege and power is inherent in just that move in the classroom. And that's not to say don't do a song from Ghana. That's to say, if you're going to do a song from Ghana, engage in the cultural context, try to engage with someone who actually practices the music and provide that opportunity to your class, and engage with the power relations of like what it means for me, for example, as a white teacher to do a song from Ghana. And that's something that I've done plenty of over my years, because I've studied Ghanaian music extensively. And I think we have to engage what it means to take something that isn't yours, to do it in the classroom, and that engaging those power relations in that way is you know what makes anti-oppression education different from a multicultural approach per se.
And just to connect the conversation we had before I started recording, you just used the term anti-oppression education, which when we were discussing terminology, you prefer that term as being more descriptive of what we're doing than social justice education.
Well, I think that goes back to my definition of social justice. I mean, I
Right.
basically define social justice for my own uses as
Mhm.
anti-oppressive education. We
Right.
are working against oppressive systems. So anti-oppression is just more specific language. And that gives us, language to work with that is very descriptive of what we're trying to do.
Um, and I'd just like to close with moving to action. As a teacher of music teachers, um, how are your students engaging with these topics when they go out into the field? And do you hear back from them? Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I try to do in my own teaching is move students from certainty to uncertainty, which is super unsettling and nobody likes it. But what I mean by that is, I think there are a lot of times that students come in with a solid approach. Like they have a methodology, they really like the methodology, they're going to do it when they get into the classroom. And what I want them to take from my classes is the idea that maybe they better wait and meet their students before they decide what it is they're going to do. And that I'd much rather than be completely uncertain about what it's going to look like in classroom pedagogy and have the students inform what drives their work, than to go in with a solid approach. And I think, we're guilty in music education a lot of the times of what Tom Rogowski calls methodolatry. Like we worship these methods that we've constructed, and that sometimes they're not necessarily good for the populations that we've got in front of us. And or sometimes we need to like break them open and take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and make our own, out of what we've learned. And I think that piece is really important. And another thing I do with pre-service teachers is I start with equity. So my classes begin with thinking about power and privilege and the different things that we need to think about to be doing anti-oppressive education. And then that discussion informs what we do from there. And I think using it as a frame is a powerful thing for us to do.
Wonderful. I wish I had studied with you when I was getting into this field. Well, Juliet, thank you for spending time with us. I hope that my colleagues out here in California get as much out of this conversation as I have talking with you.
Absolutely.
Very much appreciate it.
Feel free to share my email with them as well.
I certainly will.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Put on your face, know your place. Shut up and smile.